Welcome to Fellowship 1-7, a biblical podcast from Child Evangelism Fellowship for the Christian community. On this podcast, we discuss various biblical topics, passages, and truths, and how those truths have impacted the lives of people around the world. I'm your host, Elizabeth Yoder. Today, we're meeting with James Spencer of the Moody Center, and we're going to be talking a little bit about D.L. Moody and how he impacted the life of Jesse Overholtzer, our founder, and just kind of Moody's ministry to children. So this is a little bit different from what we typically do. Normally, we'll meet with somebody who is inside of CEF, but today we get to meet with somebody outside of CEF. So James, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to have you here. Would you mind just kind of giving us a brief introduction of yourself and your current role at the Moody Center and just kind of your history in ministry?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me. My name's Dr. James Spencer. I came out of actually higher education, so I worked at the Moody Bible Institute for about 11 years, and didn't really know much about D.L. Moody. I think I'd read, part of a bibliography as sort of an HR orientation. But when I moved to the D.L. Moody Center, which is sort of a separate entity that's based in Northfield, Massachusetts, in 2018, we were putting together a digital archives project. And so we were collecting a lot of D.L. Moody's letters and papers, and then letters and papers about D.L. Moody. And I decided to do kind of a deep dive into the digital archives. And so working for an organization whose job really is to preserve these stories, to preserve D.L. Moody's stories and much of the property where he lived when he was in Northfield, Massachusetts, it just felt like a good idea to get to know him a little bit. And so I really got my first introduction to Dwight Moody in those archives and in the letters that he was writing, not only to his family, but also to his ministry partners. And it was just really a fantastic study. I would say it was probably one of the more refreshing things I'd ever done. I earned my PhD in Old Testament theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so that had been my emphasis and, fairly academic study, a lot of journal articles with a lot of footnotes. And it was just a refreshing time for me going through D.L. Moody's letters and looking at the way that he spoke very theologically, very biblically, and very faithfully to his family and his ministry partners in these letters.
That's a really neat history. Just, seeing that side of D.L. Moody, not just, the ministry side of things, but seeing how he also interacted with his family in the same manner. I think that's kind of a neat little fun fact about him.
Yeah, it is. And it working through those archives, it was a really fantastic effort. And I would also say, one of my favorite biographies of D.L. Moody, even to this day, is the one that his son wrote. William Moody wrote a biography of his dad. And a lot of what William does is he puts together a number of different anecdotes from D.L. Moody's life, some of the various ministry settings he was in. And so you get sort of these elaborate quotes, how accurate they are, we'll never really know. But they seem like things that D.L. Moody would have said.
Right.
And but just a little bit more of an intimate, personal portrayal of D.L. Moody. And so, yeah, I think that's, one of the things that the D.L. Moody Center is trying to do is introduce people to Dwight L. Moody. And I think that as we introduce people to Dwight, we'll get to see God, the God who really used Dwight Moody powerfully in the in the 19th century. And so our ministry has been around. I came to it in 2018. It's been around a couple of years prior to that. We work out in Northfield, Massachusetts, which many people probably know D.L. Moody from his work in Chicago, the Moody Church and the Moody Bible Institute. But much of what he did was actually based in Northfield, Massachusetts, which is just a small town in West Mass. And it's probably 2,200 people. But he started a couple schools out there. He built a 2,300 seat auditorium for his summer conferences and was really his home base. He lived there as he was, whenever he'd get back from his traveling and his evangelistic efforts, he would actually just come over and come back to Northfield to quote unquote rest.
Yeah, I mean, going home, good place to be to rest, I guess. So as far as D.L. Moody and CEF, we're just going to kind of dovetail into the meat of this discussion. We know from our perspective that Overholtzer got a hold of Moody's biography and read through it and just noticed that it was odd that this man of, at that time, a sixth grade education is what he says, was so in tune with the Spirit. And so he intrigued Overholtzer, and eventually his ministry shifted Overholtzer's own perspective of God and who he could reach, and he, being God, could reach with the gospel and impact the lives of. So just to kind of look into the life of Moody, I think it would be appropriate to start with the impact of the Moody Center today and the ministry that you're doing there.
No, happy to. I think one of our biggest impacts that's maybe not as widespread as as some other ministries is just the preservation aspect.
Mm-hmm.
We actually spend a lot of time making sure that the buildings that we are called on to shepherd stay up. We actually are maintaining D.L. Moody's birthplace and his home where he lived when he came back from Chicago. So we have both of those properties. We have the 2,300 seat auditorium he built. And so that whole area, not only the buildings, but the land that's there, we're in the process of preserving. That's just sort of an ongoing day-to-day sort of thing that we do,
Yeah.
so that it stays up and people can come visit it, and they can kind of get a feel for what D.L. Moody's life would have been like. The other one that I've already mentioned are the archives.
Mm-hmm.
We spend significant time every year sort of building out these archives and trying to find these different little wrinkles of D.L. Moody's story, trying to understand the way he thought, and digitizing those and making them free to the public. And so anybody who wants to read these letters and papers, they can just go on to moodycenter.org, put in their email and click through and go in and check out the digital archives. And so that's one aspect of our ministry. I think the other side of it is that we've wanted not just to preserve, but to sort of promote and extend.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've done a fair amount of free materials, free giveaway, free campaigns. One that we have coming up is in May. We always do the Go Dark, Shine Bright campaign. One of D.L. Moody's emphases was, encouraging Christians to step away from the things that were distracting them from following Christ. And so in our day and age, technology has an awful lot to do with that, and the stories and the videos and all the other things that we read and listen to that may or may not be drawing us closer to Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Go Dark Shine Bright campaign is actually a social media fast that is designed to sort of pull people away from those distractions. And then the Shine Bright portion is an encouragement for them to go back on their social media platforms and what have you, and kind of give a testimony about how God met them during that fast.
Huh. That's really
And
cool.
so, yeah, we've had close to 100,000 people participate in that over the last couple of years. And like I said, we've done things like our free giveaway, Becoming Useful to God. That's had a significant number of downloads, I think over 100,000 now. And so we really have tried to reintroduce Moody into the evangelical conscience and just give him out there as an example, one of these more recent members of the great cloud of witnesses that we
Mm-hmm.
can look back to and learn lessons from.
That is really cool. And looking back on his life, you obviously, having gone through all this research of finding out who Moody is, have extensive knowledge of him. Would you mind just kind of touching on his childhood and his salvation story? Because it's obviously impactful enough to have influenced, our founder into changing his perspective on his Christian life that he grew up with.
Yeah, so Moody was born in 1837. And so one of my friends, Greg Quiggle, who's a Moody expert, he talks about the three big things during Moody's life that really were influencing the world at the time, and that was industrialization, immigration, and urbanization.
Mm-hmm.
And so D.L. Moody grew up in rural Massachusetts in 1837. His dad died in 1841, leaving his family in poverty. And that meant that D.L. Moody, at a very young age, probably somewhere in that fifth to sixth grade sort of range, had to opt out of formal education and begin working to help support his family. During that time, they were not well off at all, as you can imagine. D.L. Moody had seven or six brothers and sisters, and
Mm-hmm.
when his dad died, and his mom was pregnant with twins,
Yeah,
and
see,
so
that
yeah.
that overwhelms me. I'm one of seven, and just thinking like if one of my siblings had to take that role, like that's overwhelming to me.
Yeah. And I mean, if you understand the geography of Northfield, which most people wouldn't, but you're talking 20 miles to the next town kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. It's really out in the middle of nowhere, and it's a beautiful area, but it's not close to anything. And so, as D.L. Moody worked to kind of help his family, he got the bug to sort of earn money. He wanted to earn money, and so he went off and worked for his uncle in the 1850s and worked as a shoe salesman. And he was in Boston, and we often think of Boston as sort of a metropolitan place, but it really wasn't. Boston at the time was having difficulty keeping people there. Everybody was migrating to Chicago.
Mm.
And so D.L. Moody begins his shoe sales career. He's actually saved probably somewhere in 1855. His Sunday school teacher, Edward Kimball, shares the gospel with him. And that's when he starts to really think through what it means to be a Christian. He gets involved in the YMCA. He starts to do sort of part-time service in the church he has this sort of insatiable desire to understand the Bible.
Hmm.
And all of that sort of starts to cultivate, but he's still driven very much to earn money and build his business. And so that's when he ends up moving in Chicago. But that really was, interestingly, during the time of the Civil War. And so he serves as a chaplain in the Civil War while he's there in that Chicago area. He ends up building up a really strong business in shoe sales,
Hmm.
and then ultimately wrestles with that and gives it up in order to go into full-time Christian ministry. And so there's these interesting lines within D.L. Moody's life where you just see him learning to do things like shoe sales at that time, learning to interact with people, understanding what people want, how they want to hear it. He has these interesting skills that he's building up that I think really helped him from an evangelistic perspective later.
Hmm.
But he also, even as after he became a Christian, was pursuing his business, he goes to Chicago and works in the slums of Chicago with kids and works with kids that no one else is willing to work with. Starts his small Sunday school in the slums of Chicago. And so I think that his upbringing, that poor, upbringing where they were very dependent on just the people around them to make things work, really allowed D.L. Moody to gravitate to these kids. I think
Yeah.
he saw in them something that he saw in himself and just recognized that he needed to help them.
Yeah. And I mean, that makes total sense. I wouldn't have thought, I honestly didn't think about how his life, his interactions with people in the streets would have impacted his ministry. But you're totally right. It would have. He would have known how to talk to people on a personal level and not these, over your head terms and everything that we would typically associate with that time period.
That's right. And his drive was
Hmm.
unbelievable. I mean, his work ethic was sort of insatiable.
Yeah.
And so I think that we see that not only, making it a business at that time wouldn't have been trivial. That would have been a difficult thing to do.
Hmm.
And he had success there. But then to move into ministry and to do all of the different things that he did
Yeah.
were also really quite impressive.
Yeah. And I mean, I have enjoyed going to the Moody Center website and looking at his timeline and then just
Mhm.
kind of I can't do a deep dive as you have done, but just seeing how ministry impacted his life and
Mhm.
how, like you said, just committed he was and he was on fire. And I loved reading. I found a couple short stories of his impact in the lives of kids with the North Market Mission and the
Mhm.
Mount Herman School for Boys, just seeing how he allowed God to use him in an unusual, at that point in time, in an unusual way with children because they were so often, disregarded in the religious community. And seeing that, he had the heart of God and just wanted to reach these kids and pour into their lives, regardless of their situation. Like you said, they were from slums
Right.
and he was there. He was all in.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting thing about Moody and kids, Moody and children, part of it, and it depends on who you read on this. My tendency is to think that it was sort of multiple factors converging to help him make some of these decisions. But, he started boarding schools. When we're talking about schools, especially the Northfield schools, the first school he ever starts is the Northfield Seminary for Girls.
Mm.
And the Northfield Seminary for Girls was then matched by the Mount Herman School for Boys. They were two separate schools. But the first one he starts is for young girls. And a lot of people attribute that to the influence of his brother. And there's this wonderful story where he and his brother are walking and they see a young girl sitting on a porch just in this rural area, and she's making a sort of a straw hat.
Mm-hmm.
And his brother basically says, she's never going to have any other opportunity than this. And so I think what Moody was trying to do, and this comes out in the Northfield Seminary Handbook. It's actually really beautifully written, oddly, for an educational document. But I think what he was trying to do was to say, look, let's give these kids an education, and this is sort of the phrasing in the handbook, not so that they can have upward mobility in society, though that will probably come as well, but so that they may be useful to God, that they can really figure out what this means to be Christian, that the Bible can be central to the curriculum, and that these young men and women ultimately can be of God's use.
Mm.
And so his desire, I think, was he saw all this evangelism that needed to happen, but he recognized that evangelism without discipleship was never going to go as far as it would if you had evangelism paired with discipleship.
Right.
And so part of what he's doing in these schools is he's raising up a next generation of people to carry on the work that he was already doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a beautiful line in a preface of one of his books called To the Work. And he says, it is wonderful for one man to go out and do this work, but think of the impact we could have if we had 100 men doing this work.
And you can see that in how he's impacted people around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to come back to, Jesse Overholtzer and how, one, his biography impacted Overholtzer, but he also saw the impact of Moody to the point where he went to Moody Bible Institute and asked them to help with the founding of CEF. And I just think it's a beautiful testimony of Moody and the impact that he had then, and then seeing what you guys are doing now, and how CEF is growing as well is a testimony to how Moody has impacted the world since then as well.
Yeah, and I think I had the opportunity before. So his great grandson used to be on our board. D.L. Moody's great grandson used to be on our board, and so he died within the last couple of years. But I had the privilege of interviewing him prior to the end of that. And the last question I asked him was, I said, if D.L. Moody was alive today, where do you think he'd be? And he said he'd be wherever he saw the Spirit moving.
Mm.
And, I look back on Jesse Overholtzer's story and the way that CEF started and the sort of merger and partnership between Moody Bible Institute and CEF. And I say, there was a generation of men who recognized that the Holy Spirit was moving.
Yeah.
And they were doing something that was so in line with the way D.L. Moody thought. I mean, D.L. Moody got involved with so many things. So, usually it's evangelism, education, and publishing are the things that we kind of see D.L. Moody involved with.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality was much of his publishing came out of his work with the poor. He saw that they couldn't afford to get religious materials. And so he started a low cost, publishing company.
Yeah.
Because he saw an opportunity there not to make money, but to reach more people with the gospel.
Yeah.
And so I really think that part of the Overholtzer story, as I understand it, is very much in line with that idea. He's seeing something, he's seeing God moving, he's watching the Spirit move, and he is in that sort of stream with D.L. Moody saying, how can I go somewhere that the Spirit is not? Let me just follow the Spirit where he's taking me.
Yeah, I think you summed it up beautifully, just how both of them just wanted to follow the leading of the Spirit. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I've very much appreciated being able to talk to you and just, one, hear your heart for ministry and see how Moody impacted your life even, and how he impacted the life of Overholtzer as well. So just thank you so much for joining us today. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely. Anytime.
If you would like to learn more about D.L. Moody, you can go to the moodycenter.org. And there are multiple links that you can follow to just kind of give you a little bit more of an understanding of who this man is and the impact that he had around the world. If you want to learn more about who CEF is and what we believe, you can visit cefonline.com/about, and this will also be linked in the show notes. Be sure to check out our kids program, Unite Radio, where we unite children with the gospel. And we'll see you next time.